Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Terminal Philosophy. We're taking a little bit of a detour of our chronological discussion of the history of warfare and focusing in on the war elephant as used in classical antiquity. From the rough bookmarks are going to be Hydaspes in 326 BC to Thapsus in 46 BC. And I think it's somewhat relevant because recently we've been covering the wars of Alexander, the Diadochi, and Pyrrhus, and elephants loom large in this. And of course, when we finally get to Hannibal, elephants will loom large in the story of Hannibal as well. And also because in popular culture, elephants in classical antiquity or in mythological fantasy settings are very popular and attractive, from video games like Age of Empires to Tolkien's Oliphaunts, at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. So there is this sense in which an ancient warfare unit also is popular in the public consciousness and creates its own set of problems of looking at it. Now, originally, the ancient historians described two different kinds of elephants, the Indian elephant and what they call the African elephant, which is not the same as the African elephant we all know today. Many scholars used to think that the classical sources were wrong and showed they didn't understand what they were talking about, because we all know the African elephant is much, much larger. The African savanna elephant is much, much larger than the Indian elephant. But it turns out that with archaeology and careful reading of the texts, and we've figured out that there was a now extinct smaller forest elephant, which was native to Morocco and Numidia, which was called the Atlas elephant. And that was the smaller elephant. So, for example, I think it's at the Battle of Raphia in 217. The historical accounts say that the Seleucids had larger elephants than the Egyptians, the Ptolemies. And that's because the Ptolemies were using the smaller African forest elephant. And one of the things is the information on the African forest elephant, as far as its dimensions, are very hard to come by. From the sources that I've read, it seems to be that they were about 3 meters high at the shoulder and maybe about 3.5 to 4 tons in weight. Whereas the Indian elephant is a lot easier to come by their dimensions. Their dimensions are about 3.5 meters high, and they weighed about 5 tons. The one thing that we seem to see from the historical record about their use was that elephants from the Indian variety would have towers built on them where they could hold maybe 4 to 5 troopers who could sling stones, fire arrows, or throw javelins from height onto enemy troops. And then there'd be a driver, the Mahu, who would drive the elephant. And in case of the elephant going into a panic, would have a chisel that he would hammer into the back of the elephant's skull to go into the brain to kill it instantly. Because a rampaging elephant would be a disaster for everybody on the elephant and everybody around the elephant. The smaller North African elephants don't seem to have had towers. Not that they actually needed towers. An animal that size is a weapon unto itself. They can trample you underfoot, which generally elephants are less likely to do, because obviously their feet are sensitive and soft, and if they walk on something that could puncture their foot, they also seem to have an aversion to that. There's some accounts, I think, where Hannibal tries to punish a captive Gaul by having an elephant trample on him, and I don't think the elephant wants to do that. They're more willing to grab you with a trunk and fling you across the battlefield, which would probably instantly kill you as soon as you hit whatever you were going to hit, or gore you with its tusks. Now, this was common in India. I don't think it was as common in the classical setting. They would also put like sheaths of iron or steel on the tusks to increase the penetrating power of the thrust. And the mere size of the creature alone would spell fear and terror into the hearts of only the most veteran and well-motivated troops. And that's sort of the elephant as we get it in the classical world. Now, the first time a Western army in the historical record confronts elephants is Alexander at the Battle of the Hydaspes. And what is extremely important here is the Hydaspes is generally regarded as one of Alexander's most hardest fought battles. And it's no coincidence that after that battle, his troops no longer want to invade India. Arrian uses the argument that many people make about war elephants is that, well, they really weren't that effective. It was more just like, the guy that owns a massive pickup truck that takes a C note to fill it up with gas is bragging rights for how rich you are. There was probably an element to that, but the fact that it was used so readily and exported so rapidly. So within 40 years of it being introduced, from 326 to 280, it's already in Italy, right? Pyrrhus already brought elephants to Italy. So within 40 years, it went from India to Italy. And Pyrrhus, the Epirot kingdom, was not a rich kingdom. It wasn't like, Macedon. It wasn't like, Egypt or the remains of the Persian Empire. This is hardly something that you would want to waste time on with a luxury, especially if you're the small peripheral kingdom. I think it demonstrates that their effectiveness. And Plutarch, or Arrian, describes in the Life of Alexander that the elephants, quote, demolished the phalanx. I mean, I read when I was a kid, the Arrian's history of Alexander. He never describes the Macedonian phalanx getting demolished anywhere else. It really just goes to show how brutally effective these people are. Now, these elephants are. Now, according to the sources, Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch agree that the soldiers of Alexander refused to go any further because when they heard that the Nanda Empire had 4,000 elephants and Pyrrhus only had like a measly 100, they're like, yeah, nothing doing. Now, generally, a lot of tertiary histories of Alexander will say that even Alexander, he still wanted to press on, but the troops didn't. But according to Megasthenes of India, he says, thus Alexander the Macedonian, after conquering all of Asia, did not make war upon the Gangridae as he did on others. For when he arrived with all his troops at the river Ganges, he abandoned as hopeless an invasion of the Gangridae when he learned that they possessed 4,000 elephants well-trained and equipped for war. So all the accounts agree that the troops balked at fighting more elephants, and some accounts seem to indicate Alexander as well realized the futility of it. So I guess Alexander's uncle from Epirus, who complained that his son was only fighting women, could rest at ease that his son finally had to fight elephants and gave up the fight. His nephew finally had to fight elephants and gave up after that. The other thing I'd add is as to their effects, their effectiveness in battle. No ancient source makes light of elephants, even those commanders who successfully defeated them, like commanders like Scipio, commanders like Ptolemy at Gaza, or Caesar at Thapsus. Nobody laughs at elephants. Chariots, on the other hand, become a laughingstock. Plutarch, in his Life of Sulla, when he describes the Battle of Chaeronea, the legions are just laughing. They're just cheering and laughing at the scythe chariots of Mithridates. So we need to remember, while people might laugh at chariots, nobody laughs at elephants. Plutarch, at the Battle of Asculum, describes the elephants as the Romans viewed them as irresistible as an earthquake, and that while they might resist the phalangites or cavalrymen to the death, the elephants, they'd flee in terror. We read that in Galatia, Antiochus I defeated the Celtic Gaelic invaders at the Battle of the Elephants. They were so important, it was called the Battle of the Elephants. And we also read at the Battle of Tunis, when the Roman general Regulus in the First Punic Wars is being attacked as attacking Carthage, trying to repeat the strategic insights of Agathocles and later Pyrrhus, making a direct attack on Carthage. He fails, in large part due to the elephants. Polybius writes essentially that they completely annihilated the Roman lines, penetrating the lines of the Roman legion much the same way that in later centuries armored panzer divisions would penetrate through enemy lines. They're not as fast as panzers, and Polybius seems to indicate that the cavalry continued the pursuit, but the elephants achieved the breakthrough. We also see at the Battle of Trebia, being hemmed in by elephants and cavalry, the Romans were scattered. So it seems to me that elephants and cavalry, when used by Carthage, had kind of a 1-2 punch thing, where Carthage would use the elephants to achieve a breakthrough, and then the pursuit would be done by the cavalry. And we could even see a similar thing with Pyrrhus. obviously at Asculum, any pursuit wasn't done by the elephants, it would have been done by his companions. And so I think also we see at Ipsus where Demetrius was, or sorry, not Demetrius, his father Antigonus was surrounded by elephants and unable to escape and was killed, cutting the head off the snake, by Seleucus and all the other successor generals, that the whole entire front collapsed. And so elephants were a high reward, high risk unit to deploy on the battlefield, but they were deployed. There might have been some bragging rights to it. I'm rich and powerful enough to bring elephants to the battlefield. But the point is, elephants were highly effective. Elephants, if you read the ancient accounts, where they were decisive, they all agree they were the key factor. At Asculum and at, I can't brain fart right now, Pyrrhus's first battle with the Romans, elephants are determined as decisive. The Battle of Tunis, decisive. Ipsus, decisive. Hydaspes, they almost delivered Pyrrhus the victory. It was a very near-run thing. Arrian doesn't mince words. They almost penetrated the phalanx. It was only the training and discipline of Alexander's veteran forces, who we've already described would become the Silver Shields and the Diadochi, who were able to hold off the elephants. In fact, only the Silver Shields could have pulled that off in all likelihood. So that's sort of an introduction to the two species of elephants that were used and their equipment and training and actually how they were used successfully in combat. So terminal philosophy, what are some of your thoughts?
Right. Well, before we start the long march through Roman history in our ongoing series here, it's definitely important to take a look at key shifts within the history of warfare, like the development of new weapons and tactics or something like that. And of course, one of the big shifts in combat history of antiquity is the introduction of elephants in armies. And this was, of course, something used by the kings of India as early as the 6th century BC in India. There's not much evidence that they were used in widespread, like early Vedic India, but certainly by the 6th century, they were becoming more and more commonplace. As you had mentioned earlier, the elephants were not only a way to aid infantry in battle, but they are also presented sort of a status symbol, a prestigious sort of symbol of rulers in India. Now, what's interesting is that elephants have been used from this time, from basically 6th century India, all the way until the Indian independence in 1947. Now, that's a pretty flabbergasting time scale. So, but really, their focused heyday, as we've mentioned, are really from the Battle of Hydaspes to Thaspes. Because today's episode is a bit more free-flowing, for me, one of the interesting things about elephants is how often they bailed out commanders from making either bad decisions or turning the tide in stalemate battles. One of the generals that comes to mind is, of course, Pyrrhus in his battles with Rome's early legions. Now, there's a lot of tactical and strategic mistakes that Pyrrhus had made, one could argue, but I think if he had more elephants, it's not unreasonable to argue that he probably would have been more successful against Rome and Carthage, and more of his veteran troops perhaps would have survived these earlier battles. General Bradley in World War I, it was either Bradley or Patton or Alexander, you'll have to forgive me, but it was really described the Sherman tank as a sledgehammer for the infantry. And I tend to think that that's a fair analogy for the elephant in the warfare of antiquity. If you don't mind the comparison, I mean, elephants really are the tiger tank of antiquity. And as you mentioned before, Plutarch describes the Roman fear of elephants as being like an earthquake. And there, in researching for this episode, there is sort of a pushback against the use of elephants that you'll find here and there, that there is sort of this opinion among certain historians that elephants weren't as frightening or as effective as they were thought to be. But again, rather than just isolating yourself to just modern historical interpretations and really paying some service to some of these primary sources like Plutarch and Arrian and others, just these more contemporaneous sources. Well, elephants were the big hot item on the battlefield, and everything post the Battle of Hydaspes, the demand for elephants to come into the Mediterranean world was just skyrocketing. Now, of course, there were various different uses of the elephants, and how they were used. Like, again, being, of course, out on the flanks of different armies, like from Pyrrhus, where they would sort of cut in from making basically a pincer move, and then therefore letting the cavalry kind of clear up fleeing troops from that pincer move. And again, depending on which faction was using the elephant, there were many modifications made to them, like the sharpening of tusks, adding iron to tusks, adding armor, adding towers, dedicating additional now I forget the name of the elephant riders, or the tamers.
Maho.
Thank you, Mahos. Yeah, so there was more dedicated and trained handlers for the elephants. But yeah, I mean, as you had mentioned earlier, I think it's a good executive summary that there were very high reward and high high risk type of a situation, but also again, I think within the Diadochi Wars, really that's when you see the big demand for elephants to come in to the Mediterranean. And I think they were in India. It appears that not only were they used for warfare, but again, it was very much a status sort of symbol. And I think, yes, it is a way of showing off sort of a martial prowess by marshaling dozens of elephants in an army. But I think the status was probably less important to some of these Greek generals, because what they really wanted them to use was just as this heavy weapon against seemingly undefeatable phalanxes from other armies. I will say too that in some of the research that elephants, they were certainly worth it in to be marshal or to be fielded on the flanks of different armies, but they were very logistically intensive. Again, the loading and offloading of elephants between from ancient Messina to the southern Italian coast, and moving elephants across seas, a very often precarious thing. And many elephants drowned at sea from storms while being transported across the Mediterranean in various examples. But yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you that, or at least what I think we're more or less sort of coming to a similar opinion, that really based off of these contemporary sources, I mean, elephants are just frightening to deal with. And again, even the most disciplined and battle-hardened troops, they really had, you just can't go toe-to-toe with an elephant unit. You have to be innovative in the ways that you go against them. Now, I'm sure we'll get to this soon, but it would appear that some of the more innovative ways of dealing with elephants ranged anywhere from caltrops to concentrated missile fire, noise, and ways of making elephants run amok. And we'll get to this in a moment as well. But if any of the listeners have ever played games like medieval warfare, Total Warfare 2, where you can field elephants later in the campaigns, you will find that if the elephant units are in any way disrupted or become panicked, well, they'll start running through all of your ranks, and that can completely change the tide of battle. But we'll get to that here in a moment. But I think that's a good introduction for this subject.
Yeah, and I think it deserves at least hearing the account that Plutarch gives of the Battle of Tunis and the use of elephants. I think this is important for two reasons. One, it shows how decisive and overwhelming they are. And two, this is about 30 years after the war with Pyrrhus. So the Romans should, in theory, have already been familiar with elephants. And they did seem to develop a counter at Beneventum, which we'll get to a bit later. Those stationed in front of the elephants were less fortunate. The maniples in the front were thrown into utter confusion by the crushing weight of the animals. Knocked down and trampled upon them, they perished in heaps upon the field, yet owing to its great depth, the main body remained for a time unbroken, but it was not for long. The maniples on the rear found themselves outflanked by the cavalry and were forced to face round and resist them. Those on the other hand were forced their way to the front through the elephants and had now these beasts on their rear, found themselves confronted by the phalanx of the Carthaginians, which had not yet been in action and which was still in close, unbroken order, and so were cut to pieces. This was followed by a general rout. Most of the Romans were trampled to death by the enormous weight of the elephants. The rest were shot down in the ranks by the numerous cavalry, and they were only a very few who attempted to save themselves by flight. But the flatness of the country was unfavorable to escape in this manner. Some of the fugitives were destroyed by the elephants and cavalry, while only those who fled with the general Regulus amounted perhaps to 500, who were after a short pursuit made prisoners with him to a man. So clearly the elephants are essentially the heavy tanks that achieve a complete total breakthrough of the Roman line. And the Numidian cavalry, or you might call in World War II vernacular, cruiser tanks. They were the tanks that could exploit the breakthrough and then follow it up and chase the Romans. Now, elephants could go bad. And when they went bad in a big way. So, for example, Pyrrhus at the Battle of Beneventum, the Romans created a sort of a logger at their camp when Pyrrhus led a flanking maneuver at night and started their velites started throwing slings and javelins at the elephants, which drove them into a panic and crashed into Pyrrhus's army and did a lot of damage. We see at Zama, Scipio defeats the elephants with trumpets, and they also scatter and run away, stripping Hannibal's flanks of his cavalry protection. So we can see that when elephants do backfire, it's not good. It's actually really bad. But I think what people need to understand is that these are a high risk, high reward unit. No unit has all, virtue and no defect. And furthermore, you could argue that mistakes were made in the deployment of these forces. That's a possibility as well. I mean, why would you set Pyrrhus, set elephants into the city streets of Argos? Why would you do that? I mean, he seems to not understand how you use an elephant. So I'm not surprised he made some mistakes with the deployment of elephants. But what I would say, though, is counters. The first counter that we read of in the historical record is actually spiked floorboards. Diodorus Siculus, in his accounts of the Diadochi, report that when Perdiccas was trying to cross into Egypt and was meeting a resistance at a stronghold held by Ptolemy, they were trying to use them as off siege weapons to batter down the gate. And so when some of them got into the city, what ended up happening was they got their feet stuck on these floorboards. So according to Diodorus Siculus, the Megalopians, however, under the leadership of Damis, who had been in Asia with Alexander and knew by experience the nature of these animals, got the better of him completely. Indeed, by putting his native wit against the brute force of the elephants, Damis rendered their physical strength useless. He studied many frames with sharp nails and buried them in shallow trenches. Concealing the projecting points over them, he left a way into the city, placing none of the troops directly in face of it, but posting on the flanks a great many javelin throwers, bowmen, and catapults. And what ended up happening is the elephants got stuck. They were angry because their feet had been punctured, and they got shot to pieces by missiles and catapults. The second, now that's sort of in a very niche situation. It's a city. It's a besieging event. Again, don't send elephants into cities. Bad idea. But the first open field pitched engagement where elephants were defeated with a stratagem was at Gaza 312, where Ptolemy and Seleucus used caltrops, which were basically tetrahedral spikes chained together to stretch over long areas, which the elephants ran onto, were maddened, and then fled. So spikes, they don't like spikes. It's a good, in addition to spikes would be in his military principles of the Romans, Aegidius points out that there were accounts, which he doesn't specifically mention, which might have been lost to history, of troops wearing spiked armor to prevent the elephants from grabbing them with their trunk. And something that I'm somewhat doubtful existing, but I would love to see in a video game or on the big screen, are armored chariot lancers. He describes chariots horses and horsemen in spiked armor with lances charging at elephants. But okay, I mean, that's interesting. One of the most effective and common ways to counter elephants was concentrated missile fire. It also worked against horses as well. And you'd also want to aim for the eyes or the ears, because if a missile like a sling stone or an arrow goes right into the eye, goes into the brain, and instantly kills the animal. The ears are soft and sensitive and will madden the elephant. And so, as far as I can tell, one of the first instances of this being used was at Beneventum, where the Romans in their lager throw slings and javelins at the elephant to madden them. Caesar reports in his African War that elephants particularly didn't like sling stones, and at Thapsus, he placed his slingers and archers opposite the elephants of Scipio and used them to great effect. So, as we saw also with Damis and the crossing at the Nile, he used catapults, and Vegetius also recommends using catapults against elephants, probably more in a fixed position like a siege. You could take portable catapults, but they'd be a good deal smaller. No doubt they'd be effective. I mean, Alexander used them to cross the Jaxartes, so you could do that. So concentrated missile fire is probably the most reliable way to bring down an elephant. Also, we have the account of loud noises. So Scipio uses trumpets at the Battle of Zama to rout Hannibal's elephants. And then a third way, which we see a preview of with regards to the scythe chariots, was Alexander at Gaugamela having highly disciplined troops that could, at a signal, create gaps in the lines to then funnel the elephants through and then surround them with missile troops and veteran soldiers and destroy them in detail without having suffered much casualties. Scipio does this as well at Zama. And this is what's interesting. The key thing to bear in mind is that elephants are best countered by veteran troops. What matters more than the training or the equipment is, are you a veteran soldier? Whether it's a Macedonian phalangite at Hydaspes, a Roman legionnaire at Zama, a slinger, which I'm presuming are going to be Balearic slingers, or archers. What matters most in setting up to elephants is, are you veterans? And if you're not, as the Romans at Asculum and Tunis, it's not going to work. You're going to get crushed. Or the Gallic war bands in Galatia in the 280s when they fought against Antiochus rather. And so veteran troops, but you see, that really raises the threshold here, right? Elephants are essentially super effective against everybody but veterans. And the massive setbacks of the use of elephants are the result of facing veterans or very clever people. And since, Hannibal's and Alexander's and Scipio's and Caesar's are not a dime a dozen, you're going to have a pretty high guarantee of achieving good results using elephants. Now, if you do go up against a military genius, then he will probably be able to find a stratagem to get around it. With regards to loud noises, there also seems to be, at least I've come across accounts online, of the use of war pigs, either as creatures that were covered in pitch and set on fire, so their screams would terrify the elephants, or just the noise of pigs in general. And what I find to be dubious about these accounts is that none of these accounts actually come from military historians. They come from philosophers and natural philosophers. So Seneca of Anger writes, the elephant fears the sound of a pig. Aelian, in his work on the nature of animals, writes, either because elephants by some instinct hate and loathe pigs, or because they dread their shrill, discordant sound of their voices. Aelian attributes the Roman success at Beneventum to the deployment of pigs. To my knowledge, there are no actual historical accounts of pigs being used against elephants. Another account that I've come across was that in 544 AD, Procopius describes in the siege of Edessa that the bishop held an elephant basically on a sort of a wench arm hung over with a rope in front of the elephants to scare them off from Persian attack. And again, I looked through just Procopius's work. No mention of pigs at all. I think that's almost entirely apocryphal. And the accounts that can be validated, such as the quote by Seneca and Alien, seem to be dubious to me. I'm not saying that's not possible. I mean, we need a Mythbusters episode on this, is what I'm saying. But I don't really think pigs were used as anti-elephant weapons. The Romans tried the anti-elephant carts with like long, sharp lances and spikes to ward off the elephants, which Pyrrhus just countered with his skirmishers. And I think lastly, an effective way to fight elephants was used at the Siege of Sparta in 272 BC. Elephants can't jump. So if you dig a trench long enough and wide enough, you've essentially prevented the elephants from being used. And that is exactly what the Spartans did. So loud noises, missile fire, spikes, and trenches all are very useful stratagems that have been proven time and time again to be effective against elephants. But more than all of that is the need to have veteran troops that can master their fear and stare down these 3.5 to 4.5 ton monsters.
Right. Well, as you said, one of the best counters against elephants appears to be veteran troops who can hold ranks with their phalanx. As you know, throughout this period between Hydaspes and Thapsus, that really it's just disciplined phalanx or legion formations that are able to sort of weather the storm of putting up with different elephant attacks. Plutarch's The Life of Alexander the Great is, as far as I know, and as far as the chronology goes, the earliest account of encountering elephants in battle. There's been a lot of modern speculation, as you were saying before, that pigs were used against elephants, particularly in the siege of Megara. And this is sort of fairly anecdotal because, again, there's not this repeated. There doesn't appear to be this like repeated use and pattern of as they've been described as war pigs, not to be confused with Black Sabbath, but throughout antiquity consistently, this appears to be somewhat more of a if it did indeed happen, it was definitely an improvised move of desperation against them. I'm not saying again that it didn't happen, but it's just it's very unique amongst the various tactics used against elephants. So that was definitely interesting to read about. Now, to go along the line of elephants coming up against veteran troops, well, elephants easily crushed huge armies or larger forces of forcefully conscripted men. We've spoken about this in the past where the quality versus quantity issue, which I think those conversations started with, some of the research and reading we did into the early Persian armies. And one thing that I think we concluded is that once you have forcefully conscripted a massive army across multiple regions, you have issues of communication, you have various degrees of loyalty. What are they fighting for? What do they get out of it? Do they get land? Do they get 40 acres and a mule? Do they get nothing? Is this a way of shortening a indentured servitude, or is there a larger sort of ethos that they're fighting for? So to wrap a bow around that point, if an army is not sort of unified in sort of a spirit de corps of under a common culture, or there's some sort of tangible benefit after the war or the battle that they're fighting, well, then that in general has huge implications for the quality in which that army will be able to present itself in battle. And again, these large conscripted armies, who didn't have this training, who didn't have the benefit of being under the military reforms of Philip. Well, it's one thing to come up against cavalry and well-disciplined phalanx formations. It's an entirely different monster to come up against all of that and elephants. So, yeah, it would be. Elephant. Just take a moment to reflect on the psychological aspects of coming up against an elephant, and you're just some. You're some spearman from Central Asia, and you're in this, you're fighting the Greeks, or you're fighting some, former general of Alexander. It'd be awful. And, another thing, even, again, this might be a little bit anecdotal, but even veteran commanders like Antigonus. Well, he was ultimately done in by elephants because elephants basically surrounded his formation, and he was unable to be relieved by his own cavalry. So, if used properly, again, you can also basically, as you said, cut the head off of the snake, and yeah, you can create a lot of damage. But yes, of course, within Gaza, within the siege of Megara and Beneventum, there are all various examples of elephants being thwarted. With Beneventum, there was, of course, the long flanking maneuver that took all night, and elephants were sent on that flanking maneuver. But the terrain, it's one thing to field an army with elephants on open plains. It's an entirely different thing to send them on this flanking maneuver through the mountains in the middle of the night, and that, of course, just didn't work out for Pyrrhus. So, and again, with Gaza, you've got the use of caltrops, and Megara, whether it was from pigs or from fire or some disruptive noise, if the cohesiveness and if any calmness on elephants is disrupted, I mean, you can lose a huge portion of your own men. Or even if you have an army that's in a good standing formation or in good spirits, I mean, if you've got elephants trampling your veterans, well, yeah, that's not obviously that's not good either. I think one other thing to add too is that elephants that were used later on. Now, of course, this goes outside of our focused time range here. This goes well beyond Thapsus, or Thaspus, but the Middle Age, the use of elephants in the medieval period was interesting because different Arab factions would put towers on top of them, and there would be basically like early rifles used. And sort of the weird and kind of funny irony is that you'd place several men on top of it and firing weapons. Well, a lot of the times it would frighten elephants as well, and so they'd be used fairly quickly, but then gunfire happened to frighten elephants as well. So yeah, again, they had to be used well. And I think I agree with you as well on the sort of counter against elephants, that probably the most effective way, in addition to just veteran troops who can hold in a good formation, is also just concentrated missile fire. And but again, at various times and throughout this time period, different armies had different knowledge, had varying degrees of knowledge against elephants, and news traveled much slower back then, of course. And Ptolemaic Egypt would have had a lot more information on how to deal with elephants than, say, early Carthage during the Pyrrhic War. So the news and effectiveness and innovations as far as war elephants goes kind of started east and moved further west as time went on. At least it appears that way. So yeah, I think I'll end that comment there.
The other thing too, and one thing that feeds into this narrative that elephants ultimately weren't very effective, is that the Romans, who I think correctly are viewed by most historians as the premier military force in antiquity, didn't use elephants. And therefore, that was because the Romans didn't think they were useful. Well, okay, there's two problems with that. One is that they actually did use elephants. At the Battle of Cynocephalae and at Pydna, there are records of the Romans using elephants. And again, they were considered valuable enough that the Republican forces under Scipio and Labienus would use them at Thapsus against Caesar. And of course, the fact that Caesar has to tell you in his African war that he shipped elephants to his own army to get them used to the smell and sight of elephants, to train his people to be ready to fight them, shows you how much he viewed them as a threat. Because we don't see Caesar importing other animals or other troops for his men to learn from and get acclimated to. Because he knew the only way to stand up to an elephant was with a veteran force that was acquainted with them. And so we see that the fact that he had to bring them over shows that he respected them as a grave threat. But Livy writes about the effectiveness of elephants at cynocephali. The newly arrived part of the phalanx, in a column instead of in line of battle, in marching rather than in fighting formation, had hardly reached the crest of the hill. Though Quincitus saw that his men were giving ground on the left, he sent the elephants against these unformed troops and followed up with a charge, rightly judging that the rout of part would involve the rest. The result was no longer in doubt. The Macedonians in front, terrified by the animals, instantly turned tail, and when they were repulsed, the rest followed them. And I think this actually shows you how you're supposed to use elephants, right? You kind of hold them as a reserve for like the right moment, and then you throw them at the enemy for maximum effect. Now, somebody might say, well, the phalanx wasn't formed up. Yeah, but why would anybody, A, wait for the phalanx to form up, and B, if these had been heavy cavalry or other mounted forces, the results would have been probably very similar. You want to throw your best troops at your enemy's weakest point. That's not an argument against elephants. It's an argument in favor of them, and it's an argument in favor that Quincitus would use them that way. And in the peace treaty that followed, they were not allowed to have more elephants. It was like, you have too many, guys. You can't have any more elephants. So they didn't want the Macedonians to have elephants. Much the same way that Germany after World War I wasn't allowed to have fighter planes. They didn't want them to have that advantage over themselves when they were fighting. And so the Romans did use elephants. And the other reason why after Thapsus, we don't see the Romans using elephants, or really almost anybody in the West using elephants anymore. And this is where we're going to sort of shift gears into why elephants stopped being used. Because it's not that the Romans stopped using them because they weren't effective. I think you can argue from at least Cynocephali, maybe even earlier, we have accounts of Romans using elephants. But from Cynocephali until Thapsus, which is about 150 years, they were using elephants on a regular enough basis that they were importing them from Numidia. So the most likely explanation is that the indigenous supply of elephants ran out. Due to two causes. One was their tremendous demand as weapons of war. They're just going to die, right? You send them out to fight, they're going to get killed. This is what happens. But also, I think a big culprit were the games. Right, I think Vespasian built the Colosseum in 70 AD, somewhere around thereabouts. And of course, they had a lot of mock battles. And of course, a lot of mock battles revolving around the Punic Wars and the wars against Pyrrhus. And they're going to need elephants for those mock battles. So, they're going to be importing elephants. Now, Morocco and Algeria, before they were desertified by the Islamic conquest in the 7th century, had a tremendous biodiversity of flora and fauna. There was the what have been called the Atlas bear, the Atlas lion, and the Atlas elephant. And it was the Atlas elephant that was used in these wars we're talking about. And in the Colosseum, they were all basically hunted to extinction for blood sport. And that's why ultimately elephants ceased to be used in the West, is because the local supply ran out. Otherwise, you have to get them from India. And, are you going to ship them by sea from India to Egypt? Not likely. Are you going to march them across overland like Seleucus did? Well, that only works if you control the path, right? But when the Seleucid Empire fell to the Parthians, and then the Parthians fell to the Sassanids, and then the Sassanids fell to the Umayyad Caliphate, none of these nations are going to sell the Greeks and Romans elephants. They're going to be like, no, that's our ace in the hole. You're not going to have that. They might buy it from India, but they're not going to share it with the Greeks and the Romans. So basically there was no supply. And that's why elephants in the European Mediterranean theaters, they don't completely go away. There are some like niche examples of elephants being used, but they're really just more novelties after that point. They're not a dedicated art of war kind of thing. Now, the reason why I say Vegetius mentions them specifically in his book is the Persians were using elephants all the time, and Romans had to be fighting the Persians. Elephants were also very difficult to breed in captivity. If memory serves, the Indians would often just capture wild elephants and break them in, not worth the trouble of breeding them in captivity. So when the native supply died out in North Africa, and also, to my knowledge, nobody in classical antiquity or the Middle Ages knew about the savanna elephant, which was very far south. And it would be prohibitively difficult to march, say, from Kenya to Egypt. I don't think that's going to happen either, even if they could have been tamed. So I think what we can say tentatively is that elephants were a high risk, high reward tactic. They were very effective if used properly. I'm looking at you, Pyrrhus. Don't send them into cities. It's a bad idea. And I'm also looking at you, Perdiccas. Don't send them into cities. Bad idea. Don't do that. But otherwise, if you use them properly, they're very, very effective. Only dedicated veteran troops can defeat them. And if you're going up against a genius like Caesar or Alexander or Scipio, you've got a lot more to worry about than just elephants.
Right. Well, I think that's well said. As you said a minute ago, I think that in order for elephants to be effective, I think what it really comes down to is the timing has to be just right. Again, if used too early, you run the risk of them running amok in your own ranks, or and then if you use them too late, they are likely going up against too much. Again, they're there to strengthen flanking attacks on the wings of classical antiquity army formations. I think post Diadochi Wars, the demand for elephants from India became so great that the supply could not keep up with the demand type of a situation. And as you said, pre-Islamic conquest, there were actually really sort of fascinating and beautiful areas of Morocco and even northern Mauritania and places like that, and northern Africa all throughout antiquity. I think was much more lush than it is today. But and what went along with that was just a interesting diversity of animals, and that definitely included elephants, both elephants that came from India as well as the savanna African elephant. However, again, these various demands, and then for warfare, and then later on, sort of the Roman affinity for blood sports entertainment. These the supply just couldn't keep up with the demand. Now, anecdotally, just out of my own curiosity, I could not find. I mean, there's just virtually no evidence of use of Africans in ancient or there's no, sorry, let me start that again. As far as I know, there's like hardly any evidence of elephants being used in warfare in ancient Africa. Again, just the lack of records, I think, explains that. But as you mentioned, Romans and other Mediterranean peoples definitely had knowledge of elephants in like modern day, or in Kenya, and in the Nile River Valley towards the south, and towards Ethiopia. But again, these logistical, I mean, that's just such an insane march in that time from modern day Kenya or anywhere in Central Africa all the way up to the Mediterranean. That's insane. It was already difficult getting elephants from India into places like the Mediterranean, and really they were just a really kind of an expensive boutique sort of status item that you couldn't get from Europe. And so of course there's all sorts of generals and factions trying to get sort of their own monopoly on it, but there was just no way to sort of maintain their use throughout the centuries, just because it was again, you couldn't domesticate them. They're really difficult to breed, hard to train. Again, if things went bad with elephants, as you said before, they go really bad. When it rains, it pours, type of a thing. And there's just they weren't really a long. I mean, yes, you could say that they were used from the days of Alexander all the way to the Indian independence of 1947. But those uses became fewer and fewer, and with the introduction of gunpowder, of course, the elephant just comes up against more and more robust and difficult weapons and tactics and so forth. So, yeah, I think I'll just take this as my closing comment. But they're really fascinating, and their modern conceptions are interesting as well. With Tolkien's Battle of the Pelennor Fields, where elephants are, I forget the name of the region, but they're used by the Haradrim. And of course, there's a lot to say about how accurate or how laughably inaccurate certain modern video games are for ancient warfare. But again, a great game with Rome Total War, Medieval Total War 2. At least you have some sort of visual representation as a way of understanding how elephants were used back then. Again, these aren't perfect ways of doing it, but kind of an interesting visual representation for us modern people. But I think I'll leave it at that. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'll wrap this episode up with a description of the deployment of Oliphants by Sauron. Now the fighting waxed furious on the fields of Pelennor, and the din of arms rose up high, with the crying of men and the neighing of horses. Horns were blown and trumpets were braying, and the Mumakil were bellowing as they were goaded to war. Under the south walls of the city, the footmen of Gondor and Ar drove against the legions of Morgul that were still gathered there in strength. But the horsemen rode east to the succor of Eomer, Hurin the Tall, Warden of the Keys, and the Lord of Larsonark, and Hirelen of the Green Hills, and Prince Imrahil the Fair, with all his knights about him. Not too soon came their aid to the Rohirrim, for the fortune had turned against Eomer, and his fury had betrayed him. The great wrath of his onset had utterly overthrown the front of his enemies, and great wedges of his riders had passed clear through the ranks of the Southrons, discomforting their horsemen and riding their footmen to ruin. But wherever the Mumakil came, where the horses could not go, but blanched and swerved away, and the great monsters were unfought and stood like towers of defense, and the Haradrim rallied around them. And if the Rohirrim had at their onset were thrice overthrown by the Haradrim alone, soon their case became worse, for now new strength came streaming to the fields of Osgiliath. And then basically that description that Tolkien gives us is extremely consistent with a lot of the classical sources. And again, thanks again, Terminal Philosophy. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis from the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.